All right. There's a lot here that we can unpack. So this is our final week in our 5-month sermon series on the Bible, which Heather was referring to earlier. So in the first week of January, we started with stories from Genesis. And we kind of have worked our way through, starting with Genesis, all the major stories in the Bible. And this is the last week of that. So we're finishing with a story from the book of Revelation. And that's in preparation for next week, which is Pentecost, and also the 100th anniversary of the United Church. So Jeff will be back with us next week, and we'll be celebrating that. This is also the last week of a Real Theology film series. So it's a fun thing we do every year after Easter, where we pick some of the films that were nominated for Best Picture in the Academy Awards, and we take turns preaching on them. And we kind of see if there are biblical passages that match this. And so before I'd seen either of the Dune movies, I said, I think that'll work with Revelation. And then as I was watching it, I was like, oh my word, this is like Revelation put on screen. There are so many different things we could do here. So that's why I'm preaching on Dune right now. So how many folks here have seen either of the Dune movies? All right, quite a few people. And who all has read the books? All right, a couple of people. So I was a little scared to dive into this because I was looking and the fandom has like very strong opinions about things. And I haven't read the books, I've only seen the movies. So if you're like, no, this is totally, you got it wrong, that isn't how that's said, or you have the wrong take on that, I apologize, and we can argue about it later in the Great Hall. So I'm sorry about that. So if you're not familiar with Dune, the basic story is that it's set in the future when space travel has become quite commonplace. And there are lots of different peoples that are at war with one another. So the desert planet Arrakis is known as Dune in the local language, and it has a native population known as the Fremen, who are heavily based off the real-life Bedouin communities. So they live in the desert, and kind of the imagery and a lot of the things that they do are based off Bedouin culture. They've learned how to live in safety and harmony with the elements and the animals in this really barren desert environment. But they get colonized by the brutal Harkonnen Empire, who are somewhat based off the Soviet Empire. And if it helps, this was originally written by Frank Herbert in the mid-'60s. So some of the ideas about the Soviet Empire at that time are kind of the bad guys in this, so just in a very general way. So the Harkonnens take control of Arrakis because they want to exploit its natural resources. So specifically, there's a hallucinogenic chemical called spice that they want to harvest. And it's used for religious ceremony and kind of this awakening kind of things on the planet Arrakis by the Fremen. But there's something in the chemical that helps it be used for space travel. So it becomes the most, like the hottest commodity on the market. So suddenly all the different empires want control of this spice. So they're coming to this culture and they're colonizing the people and oppressing them so they can extract their resources. So like I said, there are a lot of different directions you can take with this sort of story. So the Fremen are driven into hiding. Meanwhile, there's a secret religious society throughout the different planets known as the Bene Gesserit, and they work to amass power. And so what they do is they kind of go behind the scenes and they try to control things so that they can get political power. So they're not seen as the main ones leading, but they have lots of control behind the scenes. And one of the ways they do this is they spread prophecies. So it said that before the events of the story Dune, they had spread many prophecies in the land of Arrakis to encourage the people to wait for a Messiah-like figure to come. And so now in this story, when Paul Atreides comes, he's the main character in Dune, played by Timothée Chalamet. When he shows up on Arrakis and he's fighting for vengeance for his family that was killed, it's set up in a way that it looks like he's fulfilling all these prophecies. So he becomes a very reluctant Messiah figure. And he's very frightened. He does not want to be the Messiah because as he's subjected to the spice, he has these visions that him becoming the Messiah will result in the death of billions of people. So he doesn't actually want this, and he doesn't believe in the religious teachings. So that's a big central theme in the story. So he does what he can to kind of hold off on fulfilling these prophecies, even as he feels pushed into it. At one point, he's talking to his teacher, who's a true believer in the prophecies, and he's trying to say, no, that's not me. I'm just here to help. I just want to live alongside you. And the teacher says, the Mahdi, which is their name for the Messiah. The Mahdi's too humble to say he's the Mahdi. That's even more proof he's the Mahdi. So the more he takes the name of the little desert mouse, which is this cute little innocent creature, and they're like, that's just what the Messiah would do, right? He'd want to be like this little innocent creature, and he doesn't want to kill anybody, and they're like, oh, that's even more. So he kind of can't do anything. If he's bloodthirsty, they're like, that's the sign he's going to free us from oppression, and if he's trying to be innocent and calm, they're like, oh, that's beautiful, that's just the kind of qualities we want in a Messiah. So he can't win, honestly. In the one scene you see briefly here, he's arguing with his mother. His mother is very much involved in this religious cult. And he tells her, what your people did to this world is heartbreaking. They should be led by someone from their own culture, not from someone else. And she says, but we gave them something to hope for. And he says, that's not hope. And his lover very much does not believe in the prophecies and resents them, and increasingly resents him as he's looking to be fulfilling this Messiah prophecy. As she said, we don't want an outsider to come free us. We can free ourselves. We don't need this. So in interviews with the original author, Frank Herbert, he said back in 1979 that the bottom line of the Dune trilogy is that we have to beware of heroes. It's much better to rely on your own judgment and your own mistakes than it is to give over all our decision-making capacities to a charismatic leader. So he saw that as really the main theme of Dune. And again, it could go in lots of different directions. You have indigenous communities being colonized, the degradation of an environment, people fighting over resources and having this really brutal, militaristic kind of society. But Frank Herbert said the main focus for him was on this kind of danger of a charismatic leader. And I find it really interesting because, as we've talked about in our Bible series, this is just a thing that we do as humans, is we really want someone to come save us. So when we were reading the Old Testament or the Hebrew Bible, and we were looking at Moses, some of the stories of Moses, when he's given the 10 Commandments, he's with the Israelite people in the desert at the base of Mount Sinai, and suddenly God's voice is speaking from the mountains and reciting the 10 Commandments. And then God pauses, and the people say, this is really terrifying. We don't want this. You know what, Moses, you should go up on the mountain. You can talk to God. Come back and tell us what God says. We don't actually want this ourselves. It's too intense. It's too intense to be called to do the work ourselves. We want someone else to do it, and then to just tell us what to do, because that's a lot easier. And we see that later on in some of the stories from Paul. When Paul is writing to the churches, you see him often referencing leaders and what it means to be a good leader. And he says, be careful of leaders that are going to lead the people astray. We want to be like Jesus. But he said, you're going to get people who are untrustworthy, who are just in it for fame or power. And you have to be very discerning about that. And even in seminary, that's a great seminary word, discernment. There's lots of discussion of discerning. Because otherwise, the sort of people that want to have that kind of power are not the people who are very Christ-like, and not the people we should be giving over our judgment to and following. But that's what always happens. So in Thessalonians, Paul tells the people, one way you can do this is remember to rejoice always, to pray without ceasing, to give thanks in all circumstances, and to test everything, and hold fast to what's good, but abstain from every form of evil, and watch out for evil. So you have to stay vigilant. So someone might have certain qualities that look like things you should follow, but stay vigilant and keep that judgment, keep discerning to make sure you're not being led astray and you're not just giving up all your own power. And now today, at the end of our Bible series, we come to the book of Revelation. So it's said to have been written by John on the Greek Isle of Patmos. So the original tradition held that this John, who wrote the book of Revelation, is the same John from the Gospel of John. And then there are 3 epistles from John. So originally, church history said that there were 5 writings in the New Testament written by John. But now modern scholars more or less agree that there are actually a few different authors writing these things, that there was a whole Johannine school, kind of a school of thought, which was very common at this time. So rather than one person writing all the things coming from a particular tradition, you have a group of people who are worshiping together. And the people who are worshiping together wrote the Gospel of John and also the letters from John. But this John of Revelations came later. Many of the things that are referenced in the book of Revelation actually occurred later on. So they believe that was a different person or a different school entirely. So even though lots of people are named John at this time, it's a little confusing for us. It's probably a different one than the Gospel of John. And also theologically, it looks quite different, which we could get into if we wanted to really do a deep dive on it. Based on some of the clues from the visions represented in Revelation, it seems to point to things that were occurring around 95 CE, or about 60 years after Christ's death. And it seems to reference the Roman Emperor Domitian and some events happening after him. And even with Emperor Nero, it was thought at that time that Nero might come back and wage more havoc. So some of the things that are being referenced have to do with these specific Roman emperors. And the book as a whole, how many people here have read the book of Revelation? All right, we have some people. Don't worry, it wasn't homework. You don't need to have read it to come today. So it's really quite intense. There's a lot going on in it. Pastor Nadia Boltz-Weber, she somewhat hilariously said having this book close out the Bible is a little like putting a spiritual monster truck rally at the end of an opera. Where you have this beautiful, grand, sweeping story, and then you end it with this big, you have dragons and beasts, and massive battles, the destruction of the planet, and then a new heaven and earth come, and suddenly there's peace. So there's a lot going on in Revelation. And I don't have time to unpack all of it. You wouldn't like it if I tried. We'd be here for hours. And but if folks are really interested, we can maybe do another little Bible series on parts of it, which would be interesting. But it's full of lots of auspicious and worrying numbers. Numbers were a big deal in the ancient world because things weren't always written down. So if things are numbered, they're easier to remember. So we have some positive numbers and some less positive numbers. You might recognize 666. It's a less positive number. The mark of the beast, associated with the Antichrist and kind of counterfeit of the Trinity. There are lots of sevens in this book. There are 7 churches, 7 seals, 7 trumpets, 7 bowls. 7 was a very auspicious number. So you're kind of rattling off the things that are going to happen in the future. We have 7 of them in many ways. We have 4. There are the 4 great beasts, the 4 gospels. 4 is pretty auspicious. And then the number 12, which is associated with the 12 tribes of Israel, the 12 apostles. And then I don't know if you noticed this. I don't know how into math you all are. But if you do 12 times 12 times 1,000, because 1,000 was kind of the standard big number, you get 144,000. And so that was said to be the number of people who were saved in the end. So everyone else gets wiped out and eaten by the birds, as you just gratuitously saw, except the 144,000. Those are the ones who are like the true people at the end. And but that number makes sense because, again, this is how we're kind of remembering things. So, okay, 12 is a good number. So 12 times 12. So you have the 12 apostles, 12 tribes of Israel. 1,000 is a big number. That's the number of people who will be saved. And I know many people who take that number very literally, and they're very excited to tell you that they're one of the 144,000. I've met many folks like that. But I'm not here to tell you that today. If I'm ever preaching that from the pulpit, please tell me to sit down. That is not what I do here. But to kind of notice this big battle of good and evil. Because we like that, right? We don't want to think that the difficult things we're facing in our lifetime are the same difficult things that people have always been facing. The same struggles we have are the same struggles people have always had. Because we want to know that we're correct. We want to know that we're going to be among the saved, and that the people we don't like are not going to be among the saved, and that Christ is going to come back and annihilate the people we don't like. Because that's really comforting. Clearly, that was apparently very comforting. But that's how it goes. Because that's more comforting for us. Because life is too messy. It's the same reason that we were hanging out with Moses and we say, this is too hard. Listening to God ourselves is too hard. I don't want to do it anymore. God's still talking. It's getting too long. I'm running out of stuff to write it down on. I want you to go up on the mountain. You do it for me. And then you come back and tell me what to do. Because it's hard, right? It's hard to do our spiritual practices, to sit and to meditate and to listen for the still small voice, to read through the scriptures ourselves and to try to make sense of them, to hear opposing theological viewpoints and to parse them out ourselves. That's really hard, and we're tired and we work a lot and we're busy and we don't want to do that. So we want to outsource that to other people. But that's really dangerous because, in my opinion, then you get stories like this. So this Christ, I don't know if you noticed, is rather different than the Christ we had before. So this Christ, his eyes are like a flame of fire, and he has diadems, which is kind of like a crown, on his head, and his robe is dipped in blood, and he's carrying a sword in his mouth. This is Christ the Avenger, who's come back to kill all the people I don't like so that I can be counted among the saved. And we definitely can unpack that. I've definitely heard it said that the blood on his robe is his own blood because he sacrificed himself. And the sword in his mouth is coming from his mouth because it's what he was teaching. It's not an actual sword. It's the same sword that's said to kind of separate between truth and untruth. There's definitely a way that we can unpack this so that it's not just like an apocalyptic battle. But it sure looks like an apocalyptic battle. It looks like what happens in Dune. And even we see last week, Jeff was preaching in Paul, and the beautiful passage in Galatians where in the end in Christ there's only one people, no male nor female, no Jew nor Greek, no slave nor free. And here the birds that the angels are calling are eating the flesh of all, both free and slave, both small and great. Everyone's getting annihilated in this kind of thinking, in this kind of messianic hope for some big battle. So if you look through kind of the history of Revelation, it used to be understood differently. A lot of the way it gets interpreted now is based off the renegade Anglican priest from Ireland, John Nelson Darby, who kind of interpreted things in a way that have led to the modern understanding of the rapture and of some of the books and the movies and the things you see now that came from a particular interpretation of this. But still, I really like what Barbara Brown Taylor says about Revelation. She says, I have to confess, I don't like the book of Revelation. I don't like its violence, its vindictiveness, its opaqueness, its visions, its attitude towards women, its dualistic worldview, and the vacancy of love. I don't even like people who like the book of Revelation. And that resonates with me. I find that pretty worrying. I find it worrying. And in watching Dune, I found it worrying how excited people were to find the Messiah who's going to come and fight for their people and wipe out other people. It's totally understandable in the context of that story. Your people have been oppressed for generations. You want justice. But when Paul says, I don't know, I'm having these visions, and if I live into these, 61 billion people are going to die. And they say, that's okay, because at least it's not our people. That's really worrying. Thomas Merton says the devil doesn't always turn people conspicuously sinister. Sometimes he just turns us blindingly righteous. I'll read that again. Sometimes the devil doesn't always turn people conspicuously sinister. Instead, he just turns us blindingly righteous. And so when are we doing that? When are we so convinced that we're in the 144,000? And we can't wait to rain hellfire on the people who disagree with us. And when are we waiting for the Messiah? When are we outsourcing our power and saying, I don't want to do the spiritual practices. I don't want to read passages myself. I want Cathy and Jeff to tell me what they say. I don't want to do the prayers myself. I want someone else to do the work for me. That's really worrying. Let's not do that. I know it's a very strange thing being a spiritual leader, because there are certain folks that think that I suddenly know about all kinds of things that I have no knowledge of. One time I was going to the bus and I met someone and we were chatting and he said, what do you do? I said, oh, I'm a minister. And he said, oh, my landlord is struggling with drug addiction. How do I help him? I actually have no idea. I can pray with you. I can maybe possibly talk about the book of Revelations. Like, that's not that helpful. Really, honestly, I'm not a social worker. We get folks who call the church every week saying, I need access to food banks. I'm looking for refugee help. I'm looking for things that actually social workers and other people are really, really good at. And I am not. And I am just Googling things for you, honestly, because that is not what I can do, But together we can do things. I really like the United Church ethos, that we don't wait around for the Messiah to come to fix the world. Instead, we work together. We're God's hands on earth trying to do that work ourselves. I cannot help with heroin addiction. I cannot help with most refugee things. I cannot help with food bank things. But there are people sitting here who can. And we got to look out for each other in that way. And we all have our own gifts. How do we access those gifts? How do we feel empowered ourselves to do that and not to wait for someone else to do things for us? Because that's really what's going to make the change. And that change is so much better That change isn't going to kill 61 billion people. It's not going to be Christ coming with a sword in his mouth. That's the kind of work that will bring a new earth here. I entitled this sermon, "If You Meet the Buddha in the Road, Kill Him." And that's a famous Zen koan that says, if you see someone ahead of you who claims to be the teacher and who claims to know everything, don't trust that person. That's not what we want. The Buddha's last words were like, inside of you. You can hear everything. You have the power. You can access it yourself. You don't need me to access it for you. And then finally, I just have to end with this fabulous quote from Rabia. Some of us are studying the women mystics, and the Sufi saint Rabia. I thought her apocalyptic vision was so fascinating and so compelling. There are pictures of her carrying a torch and a jug of water. And she said she wanted those in the end so she could burn down the hope of paradise and put out the fires of hell, so that everything we do is for the sake of loving God on earth now and not for the sake of the afterlife. So let's work together now to try to make life better and not get so caught up in the end, who's right and who's wrong. Amen.